Ian, you go ahead and share your screen if you're there. You know how to do that, right?
Yeah, oh yeah. Can you see that?
I can.
All right.
That's great. That's really good.
Just thought it'd be a little bit easier for everyone, just kind of have a visual as I talk.
Yeah, I just forgot to turn on the video. I just did it for you, so I forgot for.
No.
Well, at least we have the video recordings of everything else.
Yeah, yeah. Okay. Whew.
Everybody back yet?
Yes. Steve's here.
David's back. Andre, you there? Andre, you there? Andre Riggs? All right. Hopefully he's here. All right. I think we'll go ahead and get started. And so you got about 20 minutes. So go about 7:05, I guess. That'll be your time. All right. Go ahead.
Okay, so here we go. All right, so this is my dissertation proposal. The title that I'm working with, I'm not married to this, is the temple in Ezekiel 40 to 48 and the dispensation of the millennial kingdom. And there's kind of a purpose for that. And in the title, I tried to at least include the elements that I kind of want to ultimately kind of have the reader come away with as the reason for kind of attacking this topic of the temple and temple theology. Well, let me begin actually with more of the need for the study. I really was fascinated in this class. I really enjoyed this class, but I really enjoyed the idea of thinking about this as a conversation, and because I can think of this more as just simply a debate, but it's also an ongoing conversation back and forth, and so Ezekiel 40:48 is a very contentious section of scripture. Every commentary that's written on that begins by saying that. There's a well-known story of a rabbi that spent a lot of time trying to figure out Ezekiel, but particularly this passage, and yet most dispensational scholars and commentators in their commentaries really don't deal much with this passage very in depth. They really kind of treat this more almost in a passing manner, and which is kind of interesting. And yet the topic of the temple has really become in a lot of academic writing emblematic of the debate between dispensationalism and covenant theology. And the reason for this, I'll kind of spell this out in the need for the study. So on the dispensational side, it's not uncommon for dispensational scholars to simply just say of Ezekiel 40:48, you know what? All dispensationalists believe that this passage will literally be fulfilled, and just kind of leave it there. And again, while that's true, covenant theologians have attacked this position and this passage vigorously, and that is kind of now we kind of survey the literature, everything that's been published on the temple, or quite frankly, even commentaries, seemingly is really from a covenant, from a millennial perspective, and so dispensational commentaries primarily deal again with the details described in Ezekiel 40:48, and this is certainly correct, especially in chapter 40. It speaks of these. It even says, talking about a measuring line and take down all these notes, and this is definitely correct. There's definitely a grand temple and a city built around the temple that's described in this passage. But dispensational scholars have kind of just left that conversation there, or that debate there. They have a tendency just to rest on that fact alone, and is just really kind of the only reason that this text must be interpreted literally. I kind of paraphrase as kind of the fact of, if you just said, oh, look at these facts, see, they have to come true, and just kind of leave it there and move on. And that's kind of, I feel kind of in reading the literature, that's kind of how we've treated this passage. But those who interpret this passage in a non-literal manner, which is most scholars, unfortunately, that's writing on this topic intentionally and purposely, really kind of have sidestepped the dispensational response to a literal understanding of Ezekiel 40:48. And they really kind of fall in two camps. The non-literal interpreters fall in two camps. The first camp believe that Ezekiel is presenting this ideal vision for the people of Israel to strive towards, to change their ways. In other words, this vision is really nothing more than an illustration that a good pastor would provide. And that's what the prophet is doing. And in fact, that it was never actually meant to be fulfilled. It's really just giving more of a blueprint, and that's kind of the idea there. Interestingly enough, a lot of these very scholars in this camp will actually contend and acknowledge that, yes, there are a lot of details in this passage, and yes, the people in Ezekiel's day would have, as well as Ezekiel himself, probably would have believed that this was going to be fulfilled, but they believed that ultimately it was never meant to be a fulfilled prophecy. And there's even some literature out there kind of talking about, particularly with Ezekiel, about whether or not, unfulfilled prophecy and how that relates to Ezekiel. But again, as dispensationalists, we understand this will be fulfilled in the future. The other group of scholars, covenant theologians, believe that, of course, they have a hermeneutical and theological obligation to begin in the New Testament. So they begin in Revelation 22. And again, this is where Dr. Beale really begins his research, and others have followed suit. He wasn't the first one to do it, but he is the most prominent right now, and other studies still are being done kind of on his work. And since what he does, and others say, well, you know what? There's a heavenly temple described in Revelation 22. And my gosh, there's some similarities between Ezekiel 40 and 48 and Revelation 22. Therefore, the new heavens and the new earth must, in Revelation 21, this fulfills Ezekiel 40:48. Now, of course, we can raise the objection, and they have to kind of raise this idea of, well, what about the fact that it says specifically there's no temple in the new heavens and new earth? No problem, right? Then their response to this is Jesus is the temple. And again, he even says so in John chapter 2, verse 19 and 21. So their response is to view this and view the spiritual temple passages in the New Testament as kind of the way to interpret or read back into Ezekiel 40:48. And so that is the problem. That's the conversation, and that's the debate. And the other issue that comes up, particularly with Beale and others, and amillennialists, is when it's yeah. And by the way, it should be Revelation also 21, 21 and 22, because a dispensationalist will say, well, what about Revelation 20? Right, in bringing history to an end and putting Satan down. Well, they simply say, well, Revelation 21 and 22 is just a recapitulation or a recapping of what was previously said, and so that's the debate. That's kind of the rub, if you will. So what I kind of see then in kind of examining how dispensationalists have kind of dealt with this, how covenant theologians have dealt with this, and other scholars, is that we really need to broaden the scope, widen the scope beyond simply just relying on a detailed account, because there is so much more in this passage. And so my hope and my thinking and what I would want to do is to positively defend a dispensational theology and kind of refute the covenant theology, again, not simply for a vengeful thing, but again, because it comes down to theological worldview and how are we going to handle these passages. And Ezekiel 40 and 48 is time and time again thrown back at dispensationalists as too difficult of a passage to fit into a theological framework. I disagree with that. My hope is that this dissertation would actually add information to the conversation, to the debate, and to the purpose. Add information to the purpose why we're given these details found in Ezekiel 40:48, right? By placing the section first and foremost within the theology of Ezekiel, okay? Because Ezekiel 40:48 is that final part of the whole argument of the rest of the book. And so that needs to really be traced in detail more than I think most have, at least on our side. And really also then put the purpose of the temple and the millennial kingdom within a dispensational theological framework. What seems to be kind of the trending kind of underpinning argument against why we would even accept Ezekiel 40:48 anymore is simply, well, is there really a need for this? And there is. And it's stated in the passage throughout the book and then carrying forward even into the New Testament. So that kind of leads me then to the thesis here of the dissertation. And so my working thesis statement here is this: a literal millennial temple is necessary, for it is the center of Christ's theocratic reign to vindicate God's name in the millennial kingdom. Okay, so again, it's my hope that this dissertation will argue that at the heart of this detailed grand temple is actually the purpose for giving such great detail and in describing such an amazing temple, right? There is a purpose for this, and the purpose of the temple coincides with the purpose of the millennium. I would also hope that this would argue that Ezekiel 43:7 really is kind of that center, because it declares that the temple to be the throne from which Christ rule. Christ will rule, therefore making the temple again the center of his reign. And again, thinking that this is refuting the fact that the temple can't simply be the presence of Christ. It is the means through which Christ will rule in the millennial kingdom. This dissertation, I hope, will also argue that the theological message of Ezekiel unveils the need for the temple to operate under God's program of restoration, again, to vindicate his name. And I'll kind of get to that, how I got to that point here as I kind of talk a little bit about how the chapters I would envision them unfolding. And then this dissertation will argue that this places great importance, again, not just on the temple, but again on the kingdom, to really give another defense to the millennial kingdom that is being refuted more and more and being accepted by many others. The refutation of a millennial kingdom and amillennialism is really kind of, especially in this area of the temple, is kind of taken off and really kind of, again, reset that debate to show that no, there's great purpose in the millennial kingdom and in God's plans. All right, so again, chapter 1, the introduction. Chapter 2, really kind of want to start off by addressing, again, first and foremost, the hermeneutics and the theology, of why it's necessary for the necessity. Let me see here. The necessity of a literal millennial temple and in hermeneutics and theology. So kind of want to begin the argument by showing that, talk about the hermeneutical views that kind of underpin those who've interpreted Ezekiel 40:48, right? And kind of show how they arrived at their position, how I arrive at mine, and again, trying to show and establish that indeed, and much of this because of the details, that this is meant to be literally understood. But they kind of move from the hermeneutics then to the theology, right? That kind of then results from the hermeneutic, and kind of understand why and how then this really kind of then I envision this part really kind of then bringing in the dispensations that dispensationalists believe is present within Scripture, so that I can set up later on in the paper the idea of placing all of this within the dispensation of the millennial kingdom. And then within this passage, also looking at the covenants, again, to show that God intends to fulfill this and intends to rule through Israel in a literal time, in a literal place, and really kind of focusing on kind of land theology, and really kind of focusing on the fact that this temple has to be, is necessarily literal, and it's not Christ because of the land promises within the Abrahamic, Davidic, and New Covenant. So it's kind of how I'd want to kind of unveil that chapter. Chapter 3 is then trying to, I guess, at least this is where my focus is in my mind, kind of the heart of the dissertation, or at least the heart of where I'm at right now. It really kind of to examine the Ezekiel 40 to 48, but within the whole book, and really kind of trace the structure, the theology, what's being said throughout the sections of the book, to really kind of give a whole picture of what's being presented in Ezekiel, and really ultimately, again, in Ezekiel 1 to 33, it is about the fact that God's presence, His glory, has to leave, because there is this His temple is being profaned. And why is that? Well, it's because of their disobedience, but Israel's disobedience. But within that, what is being set up is this confrontation between anything that comes against God, and so God needs to put that down. And that kind of sets the stage for why God's name needs to be vindicated, as seen in the restoration section of this book, in particularly Ezekiel 36:43. And so that's kind of one of the questions I need to answer in this is, why does his name need to be vindicated? Well, again, I'm kind of trying to answer that question by showing that the vindication comes in God putting down everything that comes against him. And then also then again, as I've said, then bringing that to Ezekiel 40:48, where within this temple, then Christ will rule, and we see that in the phrases of the place of my throne, in the place of the soles of my feet. And again, the idea here also that kind of runs through this book is God's concern for his name is very significant too. So that's that in this time is kind of where I'm headed and where I'd be headed in that chapter. Then chapter 4 really then is addressing the temple passages in the New Testament. And again, when we think of the New Testament primarily, and what those who do not literally interpret Ezekiel 40:48, they'll simply just have you think that it's just the spiritual temple passages in the New Testament, but that's not true. Actually, there are passages that actually reference kind of along the same theme of what is being spoken of in Ezekiel, and primarily the temple that's going to be desecrated in 2 Thessalonians 2:4. Again, it's going to be profaned, and even there, once more, this confrontation, and the reason it's profaned is because the Antichrist is going to get in there and proclaim himself to be God, like God. And so it's interesting how that's picking up on that same theme that is present in Ezekiel. So it's carrying forward this idea of the need for that to be put down. And of course, then Matthew 24 and Jesus's sermon there, and describing the dispensations and the temple still come. So, really those passages to kind of continue at least the idea that there is a purpose in the millennial kingdom and in and through the temple. It is to establish a temple that will not be profaned again, as said in Ezekiel 43:7. But then, of course, and that would then lead into a discussion talking about Revelation 20 and 21. And again, to underscore the fact that these two chapters represent two different dispensations. And so you see, that's why I'm kind of focusing on the dispensations, not just dispensationalism or just the theology, the system that we believe, but really using dispensations in the more technical sense of really kind of establishing the dispensation, the epochs, the times of stewardship in which God, through his rule and through his reign, will in fact operate. And so really kind of showing that those chapters are very distinct in their purposes and represent two different dispensations. Therefore, Revelation 21 cannot be the fulfillment of Ezekiel 40 to 48. Then chapter 5, still kind of thinking this one through, but really kind of thinking that probably would need to have this chapter just to kind of, again, talk more about God's restoration program, the show the purpose for the millennial kingdom, the temple, kind of noting the restoration passages of the Old Testament about the blessings that will come in and through the temple, and as Christ rules and reigns, to again to prove that these blessings do come from the temple, again to show that it is the center of the kingdom, and so that's kind of what I'm thinking there. That so I hadn't fully, and it would love any input on really kind of if any input on kind of where to go with that particular chapter. I have it in my mind, but can't really fully articulate and think it through how I would go about that. And then, of course, the conclusion. So,
all right. Well, thank you so much, Ian, for your excellent presentation here. And we're going to take some time now to get some comments from the other students and myself. So again, if you have a comment, if you would leave your mic off until you raise your electronic hand, I'll call on you if you would like to ask a question or okay, David, go ahead.
Ian, I just would say, do you feel then that you're going to make the argument that the temple in Ezekiel and the temple in Revelation 21 are one and the same? And if so, have you considered, like from our hermeneutics class, doing the comparison of hermeneutical analysis to look at type meaning versus, similarities versus differences?
Yeah, and I appreciate that question. Yes, that's been going through my mind. So my idea is that Revelation 20 is where the temple would be placed, and then Revelation 21 and 22 would be the new heavens and new earth. But yes, you're right, and that's kind of why I wanted to start with this paper, with really addressing those hermeneutical issues, just like you raised. And yes, that idea of some of those issues really definitely have to come into play, particularly because one of the newest works that's come out is a dissertation that was published, and it by now Dr. Andrea Robinson. And what she did is she found her niche. This shows you how much work is still here to do. She found her niche. She's working off Beale's assumptions and theological positions, but she's doing exactly what you're asking me, David, about what I need to address, because she's spiritualizing everything in Revelation 21 back into Ezekiel 40-48. And so that was kind of her niche in that. So that kind of is kind of helped me develop, wow, there is a lot more here, why it needs to be both contained to a text, but it also really needs to be placed within a theological and a hermeneutical kind of understanding, because it's all over the place out there. So yeah, thanks for the question.
David, I really liked your direction there with the type meaning, and I think there's some things you can do with this, especially comparing the Amill and pre-mill views on the temple, and comparing first temple, Solomon's temple, second temple, not only the construction, what the temples looked like, because they were different. And so you have the same word, but they had different look and the dimensions and structure. And that's where Josephus can help you with the second temple.
Yeah.
And then whatever information you can find on the first temple in the Bible. And then, of course, we just have a little minimal information on the tribulation temple, 2 Thessalonians 2, as you pointed out, Matthew 24. Also, don't forget Revelation 11, where John is measuring the tribulation temple there. All right, go ahead, Stephen. Yep.
Ian, I was just curious, which dispensational writers have you found have been, I guess, the ones you would most highly recommend? In the stuff that you've read, what has been the most compelling, most current authors?
Yeah. Well, first and foremost, my mentor, Dr. Price, he has done a lot of work in my literature review. Kind of set it up between Beale and Price right now. Those are the two. In fact, they were even went to school together and everything. They know each other very well. They're classmates in seminary and at Dallas, nonetheless. And so that's kind of, definitely who introduced me to this topic in an Israelology class, by the way, Dr. Bramaki. But who I've really been impressed with and really liked was, again, the biblical theologies. Zuck really kind of talks greatly about the importance of the temple. And Merrill, Eugene Merrill, really kind of also highlights, particularly within his kind of overarching theme of the Old Testament, his Old Testament theology, the sovereign rule and reign of Christ. And so those I really found to be beneficial to at least kind of verify, confirm, work with on what I'm kind of aiming to do. So those are the ones that I have. Conversely, this is why I kind of came at this a little, I still think of this a little interestingly. Guys like, I was surprised to find that there were dispensational scholars that also didn't handle the temple. Schaeffer really didn't handle the temple much in his discussion about eschatology. And a lot of the systematic theologians and so forth, they really didn't handle the temple much. They just talked about it more in overarching themes, which is fine. But there's a lot to what is said about, how Christ is going to use the temple. So I was kind of surprised at that, actually, in my research here, kind of this initial research for this class. So yeah, thanks for the question.
All right, just to finish up here, thank you so much for your presentation. Very excited about this as a possible dissertation. Just a few comments here on the title. I was looking at just reading through the proposal. I don't know if you wanted to change it or not, but I had the necessity of a literal temple in the Millennial Kingdom as a possible title there.
And I thought about doing that.
So the question that would makes it broader than Ezekiel 40 to 48, but I like what you had there as well.
Yes.
Just some comments and thoughts. The section 2, when you get into the hermeneutics and talking about hermeneutics, you can keep it at the general level, but let me just recommend that you go specific. Okay. And so if you're going to talk about hermeneutics, get specific with the how do the amillennialists actually do their hermeneutic? Okay. Reading New Testament truth back into the Old, right. And get their quotes and how they interpret a particular text doing that, and then critique the method. I think that would be very helpful in that chapter. Okay. As far as the covenants, page, what is that? 5, 6, I think it is. Yeah. C, that's point 2C. You have examination of the unconditional covenants. Okay. Yes. Now your subpoints under that were 1 and 2. You need to, I put an X that out because you're talking about the covenants, Abrahamic, Davidic, and New covenant. Okay. Yes. Yeah. So those are your subpoints. You got your 3 points. Right. Abrahamic covenant is the land. Yes. Okay. So that's where you're gonna trace that land promise, and then you're going to show its fulfillment in your Ezekiel 40 to 48. I did that in a paper, the fulfillment of the Abrahamic covenant. Yes. Davidic covenant, the throne. Yes. That's where you're going to connect that. 2 Samuel 7, connect that there.
You also talked about the importance
of the new covenant also has the land.
Yes.
You were pointing that out to Don. So the new covenant land promises connect the new covenant. So that's how you connect it there, which I think will make a really strong argument. Now, point 3 was the necessity of the literal millennial temple in Ezekiel 40 to 48. And as you look at your outline, A, B, C, actually you're giving the argument of Ezekiel. Okay. So that chapter, you need to reword the title. Okay. It's dealing with the argument. You're showing You're showing Ezekiel 40 to 48 as the climax, as you point out there, to the argument of Ezekiel. So you want to show that, trace that through. Right. Yeah. Another thing you might want to think about is Randall Price's work in terms of the temple in Israel's history, including tabernacle, first temple, second temple, tribulation temple, millennial temple, no temple in the eternal state. So you might want to have a section that relates that and talk about why is the temple important to Israel. And here, there's so much you can go into, especially with the Millennial Temple. You've got Jesus as the king priest after the order of Melchizedek, in distinction to Aaron and the Aaronic priesthood, and how important that is for us as dispensationalists to see that distinction. The sacrifices, probably need to deal with that as well.
Yes.
And that would be another part of that exegetical treatment of Ezekiel 40-48.
Would you do that in 40-48, or would you put that in that last chapter kind of, well, yeah, I see what you're saying. Yeah, kind of dealing with all of the different other elements that typically...
I would keep it in the argument of the book.
Okay.
So dealing with the argument, explain especially Ezekiel 40-48. You may even need just a chapter on that. The argument leading up to, but then a chapter where you're going to deal specifically with an exposition of Ezekiel 40-48. So, and explaining those verses in context, I think would be important.
So almost put a chapter before the necessity of it in 40-48. Actually, put another one previous to that.
The argument leading up to 40-48, but then just the whole chapter on 40-48.
Yeah. Okay.
All right. Thank you so much. We're going to take a break, and David Donnelly will be up next. We'll come back at, well, let's make it 7:25. So see you at 7:25 for David. Do you have a PowerPoint, David, tonight?
Yes, I do.
Okay, I'll let you go ahead and you can share that. Make sure it's up and running.
All right.
Everybody back?
Yes.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Very good. Andre, you there? Looks like he's there. I can't tell. All right, David, we're going to let you get started. Your presentation, okay. It's about 25 after, so you can go to about 7:45.
Okay. Do you see my thing on your screen or not?
Yep, you're good to go.
Okay. I'll just I'm going to put it on slideshow mode here.
That's fine.
You can still see it.
That looks
still
great.
Okay then? I can't see you, but you can see my screen.
Yep, I'm going to put my mic on mute.
Okay. I'll just mention too, I appreciate anybody bearing with me here tonight. I'm a little feeling under the weather with the pneumonia. It got me good tonight, so I'll hopefully be coherent, but I'll do my best. So my proposal for the dissertation, my title here, as you can see on the screen, a little bit long. I might have to rework it here, but it's a proposed mitigation strategy for the natural bias towards the Alexandrian text within a reasoned eclecticism model of New Testament textual criticism. And again, it's a long title. I might need to try to condense that somehow, but that kind of encapsulates what I'm trying to go after here. And really the question, the big issue behind this, which you don't often think about maybe with textual criticism issues, but it's really a question of inerrancy that I'm wanting to deal with in the realm of bibliology, because inerrancy has traditionally been defended in regards of, arguments that this canon was settled, that we have a plethora of manuscript evidence, and that we have these academic models that have given us assurances that we have been able to go back and, very accurately, because of these things, to feel like we have a text in front of us that that we can rely upon. And I think we've done a good job with that as far as it goes, but it really, our defense of inerrancy tends to center on the autographs and on the manuscripts evidence, and we often don't talk about the questions of transmission and preservation with inerrancy, and that's what I want to get into, because I think for some, maybe this isn't as big of an issue for some people as others, but I don't think we've done well to promote a confidence in inerrancy in the areas of transmission and preservation, And I think some modern scholarship has even cast doubt in these areas because we have questioned the solidification or the codification of the early manuscripts in the very early days, and we have, I think, undermined the witness of the early church fathers, the early church writings. Sometimes we've undervalued those, and I think we've also not given enough credence to the scriptures, mainly preserved through the Byzantine and majority texts, that were used and preserved by God ostensibly through most of the church age. And so I'm not here to promote a Textus Receptus position or a majority text position. I'm just trying to promote an addition or a modification to round out the reasoned eclecticism model, which I think is still the most well-rounded model, but I think that we've lost some of our defense of inerrancy with the current model because of what I see as a built-in bias towards the Alexandrian texts. And there may be good reasons for that, but we're going to explore that. So here's three premises that I think led to this bias that we see in the current reasoned eclecticism model. One is that there is a prevailing belief that there is an unsettled nature in the wording of the text in the early church. That there was a lot of scriptoriums in use. There were a lot of different church fathers, all with different ideas and different textual traditions in different regions. And I think it has created this general perception that the text was not well settled until the 3rd or 4th century, maybe. And so I think that's led to number one. Number two, second premise is I think there's been not enough appreciation for the historical preservation of the majority text that God used through church history. Now, we can all agree that there's issues and questions about the majority text. Some people say it's revisionist, it's conflationary, but the fact is it still had a major presence in church history, and I think we've discounted it too much in the last century or so with the advent of some of these seemingly older and better texts that we found. And I think we've maybe thrown some of the baby out with the bathwater and lost what it is that God actually used through much of church history. I think this needs to be reprioritized. And the third premise is that I think we've not given enough priority to the witness of the early church fathers and their writings. We focus so much on the actual text that we have available and the text families that the church fathers and their writings have kind of become sidelined. We oftentimes see them used in the textual apparatus, but a lot of times they don't get the same credence for various reasons, primarily because many have this presupposition that the church fathers were simply paraphrasing and therefore they're not accurate depictions of what the text was supposed to represent. So I think these are the premises that have led to the Alexandrian bias in the current model. And so with that, here's how I would kind of look at going through the through this dissertation, just kind of a chapter summary here, and I can explain to you where we're at with that. Of course, literature review, we need to identify where we've been and where we come and where we're going. I need to establish in the second chapter how the problem has presented itself and undermine this confidence in inerrancy for some people. I think that our current trends have moved us away from historical precedent they largely have undercut early church witnesses, and that we need to at least re-examine those factors to help bolster our understanding of inerrancy in the areas of transmission and preservation. Chapter 3, I would be going through a history of the modern critical Greek New Testament text. And again, I'll just mention this as well. We're really going to talk about the New Testament textual criticism. I'm not going to try to get into Old Testament with this because that's got its own set of textual issues related to it. So I'm really going to try to stay focused on New Testament issues and within that realm of reasoned eclecticism. So I'm going to provide a brief history of where we've come through the ages and really focus on the modern texts that began to arise after we saw Vaticanus and Sinaiticus, and and then of course the other manuscripts that we found that are supportive of those Alexandrian text types and how the modern text arose, and then begin to then understand and provide an overview of the grading system that's used, especially as it relates to the UBS and NA28 texts, because they've really arisen to become our current standards in most of the world today, in our areas at least. So then we go to chapter 5, just to talk about the what is this natural bias? What are some specific examples of it, and kind of get into some actual texts that tend to favor those. And of course, we're going to look at this in regards to the grading system that I just talked about, because obviously the grading system, you have A, B, C's, and D's, and where we have high confidence and it's graded very highly, I don't think we need necessarily to undermine those grades, but we do have a number of texts that are graded lower, and I'm thinking that some of those textual examples might be able to be graded differently if we use different criteria in them. So we're going to talk about that, and then some of the unexplored questions about the Alexandrian text. The things that we don't often talk about, there are only, seems to be maybe, it tends to come out of the Textus Receptus or the majority text camps, where they will attack the Alexandrian text type, and that's not my argument here, but I do think there are some arguments that are often overlooked regarding like the provenance of these manuscripts, and questions related to the scriptoriums behind that, as well as there was quite a debate between Origen, who put together some early, who did some early textual criticism, and then we see Jerome, of course, he did much with it, and they had much disagreement between each other. And they also, while Jerome did use some Alexandrian textual examples, he really had very poor things to say about Origen and his work and the text that he was using. And of course, Origen was from that realm of North Africa, and he would have most likely been familiar with those Alexandrian texts, which Jerome tended to not. So I think there is some valid points to be brought up that could cast aspersion at the Alexandrian text. I don't think it's as squeaky clean as some of the scholars have promoted it to be in all areas. Again, I'm not trying to undermine it, but I want to make sure we give it a fair treatment with what the facts show. And so then I want to talk about the majority text for a little bit, because I think this has been an overwhelming witness that God used through most of the church age. It was his vehicle for biblical preservation, And while there's certainly challenges to it, and there's issues with those as well, I think that we should at least appreciate the intrinsic value that this is the elephant in the room that we tend to discount since we've latched on to these Alexandrian texts. So I just want to make sure we give it a fair shake and just look at it from the perspective of how God chose to preserve and build his church with that text through most of the church centuries. I then want to deal with one of the underlying premises in chapter 8, the early settled nature of the text in the church. I think that there's a lot to be said there's a lot to be said by the church fathers regarding the settled nature of the text, and not just the canon. We often talk about when was the canon settled. But I think there's much evidence from what I read so far that actual wording in the text was not only settled, but it was hotly defended and hotly, protected by those church fathers that would consider themselves orthodox. They sometimes really fought over specific wordings and were very vehement about their position in those areas. So I think there was some sense that the settled nature, the text was more settled than maybe we are always led to believe by modern scholarship. So I want to deal with that in chapter 8. Again, then we'll talk about the early church fathers. Part of our problems with the church fathers is they're often not regarded as accurate witnesses because they're paraphrases. We want to talk about whether that's true or not. And then the other issue we have with the church fathers is how we categorize and prioritize them, because they're a mixed bag. They're not all orthodox. Some of them were heretics. Some of them wrote for various political reasons or other reasons, and they all had an agenda for some reason or another. They came from different regions of the ancient world, and they had those biases. So we have to find a way to sort them, categorize them, and determine which should be given a various priority when we evaluate their textual notes. And that's a daunting task, but I'm going to try to address that in chapter 10. Then we move from there to some revisions that I might propose, how we can incorporate some of these premises and arguments into the current grading system, and to be able to give more credence to those church witnesses and to the majority text. And then take a chapter to simply go through a listing of the many different problems, textual issues, and try to see how this new grading system that's been revised may impact changes on the text, especially focusing on those that have typically scored a lower grade, like a B, C, or a D, or whatever, something like that. And then, of course, a summary and conclusion with follow-up questions and further research that may be needed there. So that's the I don't know what my time is, but that's where I'm on battle on time. So
You're actually you have 4 more minutes.
Oh, okay. I didn't have a clock in front of me while I was talking, so I didn't know how far I had to go. But the real question comes down to then. Let me get my other notes up here. The real notion comes down to what do we do with a question of inerrancy in these areas, because I also want to talk about I didn't even get into this, but in chapter 3, I guess, we're going to talk about, or chapter 2, the arguments that still need to be examined for inerrancy, the transmission practices that led to the rise of the various text families, and then when we get into the history of the modern critical text, I do want to talk about the different models. I don't think I want to get into them in great detail, but I want to explain them at least, how the reasoned eclecticism model is still I think the most valid model compared to either Textus Receptus theory, majority text theory, and then there's this one that came up in the early 20th century called thoroughgoing eclecticism. I think that we still have the right model. I just think we need to see some tweaks to it. And so I want to make sure I talk through each of the different current critical models for that as well. And then what else was I going to tell you about this? In regards to the early nature of the settled nature of the text, there's been a lot of theories related to this in terms of how the early autographs were not just written, but their methods for transmission beyond scriptoriums. There's a I'm trying to think who it was now. I think it was one of the papers I read. But anyway, one of the authors I was reading was talking about the way in which the transmission process in the early church was a basis for community, and the transmission happened, according to this man's theory, in a very circular fashion and a very quick fashion. It was part of Christian community, and sometimes he's shown that it was sometimes just a matter of weeks, literally, where text could cross great distances, and we could see establishment across great regions of the actual settled text after it began to be transmitted. And so I think there is some things that we need to discuss in that area as well. And I'm trying to see what else I've got here for my notes. Again, I'm going to have an emphasis on those with the lower grading, and then really just go through all of those textual variants that might fit this new grading criteria, and then identify and suggest changes to textual decisions that were made based on the criteria that I come up with. So I think that's about all my time at this point.
David, thank you so much for your excellent work here on textual criticism. Very exciting research. Let's go to the students for your comments or questions. If you have something to say or ask, please put your hand up, electronic hand. Question for David. Stephen Mapes first.
Yeah, really nice job, David. One of the things you talked about, which I thought was a great point, we've overlooked the value of the majority text that God has preserved, to build his church, to expand the Bible and spread the word. Actually, I'm not going to ask that question. That might be too. How about this one? When you talked about in chapter 10, the prioritizing and ranking of the church fathers, that sounds like that could be a dissertation unto itself. Would you, just to kind of squeeze this down, are you going to focus on like the top 10 or 20? Like, I know it's an important point to get to, but how do you contain that one?
That's a good question, and that's probably one of my wild goose chases that I have to figure out how to pin down, because I want to focus. I think it has to at least focus from our first century, starting with Polycarp, and then going through at least to Jerome. And so that's a span of 300 years almost. And I think we just have to pick. I think I'm going to have to prioritize just even who I'm dealing with. I would definitely want to focus on Origen, Jerome, Polycarp, Eusebius, and there's obviously some others too that I'm not thinking of right at the top of my head. Those probably that have the largest body of work, and which I think we can quickly identify some who were obviously the heretics that have writings, Valentinus, and I'm trying to think who they all are, but anyway, there's others there, Trajan, I don't know. Sorry, my mind's a little mushy. But so I'm really trying to focus in, maybe down to maybe a dozen, hopefully less than 20, that we can just say these are and maybe look at the textual apparatus itself and say these are the ones these are the top 10 or 20 that are most quoted in the apparatus that are used in the current text, so that we can, because they're the ones that are already being cited anyway. So that might be the strategy I have to use there.
Todd, go ahead.
Okay, there's a couple questions I could ask. I'll just ask one that's kind of related. Like, when it comes to the general presumption that church fathers are not a reliable witness because of their tendency to paraphrase and use allusions, what have you come across in your research that would kind of respond back to that they might be more of a reliable source than they've been treated in the past?
Well, I'll tell you, I'll just give you one instance. And this was a dialogue that happened between Jerome and Augustine in some of their letters while Jerome was putting together the Latin Vulgate. And Augustine wrote to Jerome and was very upset with Jerome's use of a word in the book of Jonah when he translated the word gourd at the end of the book of the gourd that grew up over Jonah. And of course, this is Old Testament, but this is just an example. And Augustine was saying that this was a case where he basically took Jerome's text and had sent it to a church somewhere in North Africa. I don't know what the guy's name was. And he said that they were in such an uproar that this word was changed for this one word gourd at the end of the word Jonah. He said that the pastor there almost had a riot on his hands from the people who were uprising over this one word that he had changed in the book of Jonah. And it was just like, you can't imagine a church today having an uprising over a word, just one word. And Augustine was just giving Jerome the riot act over this because he didn't want him changing this word, even though Jerome's word was more accurate to the plant that was being used. This was just an example. I think that we tend to think, oh, these were just casual letters that you were written back and forth, and they were just like we would. I'm just writing it off the top of my head. Oh, God so loved the world or whatever, and it's not an exact word for word. But I think especially with some church fathers, we have to know who was accurate and who wasn't. I think that there was much more care taken, especially in the early years. And I think this is some of that evidence that we see shining through here and there. But you got to kind of read between the lines to see it. You just don't take it at face value all the time.
It's very interesting. Yeah, good job, by the way. Sounds like it'll be a very interesting study. Can I ask one follow-up question? Okay. So, if I can remember what it was. Yeah, like particularly, and I assume it would be in the church fathers, you'd find this, or the patristics, you'd find in the apostolic fathers, you'd find the evidence for how much of a conscious and awareness did they have about the process of arriving at a settled text. And You know, just out of curiosity, personal curiosity, it's something I've never studied, but how aware were they that, we really want to have an established, settled text? And did you see anything like that in your research?
I think you see that. I honestly, I need to study some more on this. My feeling, the gist that I've been feeling as I've read, is there was a very early. I think that number one, that the establishment of the canon. We don't have a full list of canon until the late 300s or something. But I don't think that was ever their object. I don't ever feel that way in their writings, that it was important for us to establish a list of books, because I think they always understood these books to be canon. And I think the actual text in those, I think they understood them to be, I think sometimes we tend to think more literally, and they tended to think more allegorically when they looked at the words. And I think there's a cultural disconnect there that we don't always bridge when we try to understand it from 2,000 years later. But you see very early harmonizations of the Gospels, trying to understand how the words relate, how the stories are all lined up. And you see those happen very, very early. You see collections of Paul's writings happen very early, with the exception of like Hebrews. And you see those begin to coagulate and become all one. And I think that you very quickly see that the text was just something that they did. I don't think that the prevailing thought that, everybody just had their own copy and they just lived with all the mistakes. I don't think that was as a truth as we tend to make it out to be today. I think they had confidence in their texts. And I think they knew that there were textual variations, and I think they knew some of them were because of heretics that had introduced them, but I think they also knew that some of them were copyist issues. Origen, he had at least 6 or 8 various texts which he was trying to reconcile in the early early 200s, I guess. And Jerome actually wrote about Origen and said, well, Origen, he knew that he didn't have he knew that some of his texts weren't good. Basically, he had all these old texts. He was trying to make ends meet of them, and he knew that they weren't all very good, but he used them anyway. And that's what Jerome's argument against Origen was. So, I mean, I think that there was a general consensus that there was a settled text. Whether we have arrived at that yet, I don't know. But I think that there was, within that time frame, I don't think there was a lot of confusion about it.
Well, David, thank you so much for your excellent work here. And as I think someone mentioned, you've got quite a few chapters here in your proposal. And as you continue your research, you may find out that you'll have to cut out a chapter or two from your research to make it a dissertation to 300 to 400 pages. The literature review section, I really enjoyed reading that section, and that almost deals with like a history dealing with New Testament texts. And so that literature review almost could be a chapter in relationship, like the history of the different New Testament, Greek New Testament texts, and how that's been over a period of time. Just to make sure, as you just reading through it, like on page 3, you mentioned Harry Sturtz and Maurice Robinson. When you get your formal presentation of your proposal, make sure you put the books in the footnotes from your sources. You've got a lot of great sources. In fact, I put here your next step, because you got all these great notes here in your resources, would be to take those great comments and put them in the paper itself. with footnotes. So maybe can help you to begin to organize your thoughts as you have a very detailed annotated bibliography here. So that would be sort of the next step for you to do for this, not for this class, but I'm just saying as you get ready to continue your research. Just a couple things here, some questions. Yeah, I think that, you're talking about the bias toward the Alexandrian text. Make sure you deal with that issue fairly. So, try to understand why the Alexandrian text has been viewed as a priority, at least in the reason eclecticism. One thing I had here, and I didn't know if you thought of this, the papyri, many of them are Alexandrian, but they're older manuscripts than, say, Sinaiticus or Vaticanus, if you're thinking about those particular Alexandrian manuscripts. Is there any connection between the papyri and the Byzantine majority text? Be interesting to see that if the papyri are older, if there's connection there. And I don't know if that's where an accordance search could possibly see that connection or not. I don't know, but that would be sort of interesting to see that. As far as the title goes, you might want to think about a new reason eclecticism, for to keep it as a positive rather than sort of disparaging the Alexandrian text, maybe a new reason eclecticism model of New Testament textual criticism. So basically you're working toward showing us a different approach to grading. And that's where you're going to need to give us really some specific examples. One of the examples that sort of came to my mind, because I just got done teaching Hebrews, is it was mentioned in Don Trest's proposal, Hebrews 9, verse 12. And I believe the King James says, with his own blood, he entered the most holy place. And I don't have my majority text over there. I'm going to take a look at it at the break. But the Greek text I have here, I have UBS 3, it says dia with the genitive. So it actually is through his blood, not with his own blood. So that view that Christ went into Holy of Holies with his own blood as high priest is really not a true statement. So be interesting to look and see what the majority text has on that.
Good. Yeah, that's very helpful.
So that's why I'm saying you have to sort of weigh the older manuscripts with the majority manuscripts, and so that's where somebody like Dan Wallace, he's going to put more weight with the Alexandrian. So you probably need to check out what he has to say.
Yeah, I know I came across kind of with my guns blazing against Alexandrian texts, which that really wasn't the point. I still think they should be highly valued, and I don't disagree with the scholarship that's done. I just think that it's maybe out of balance. So maybe the idea of taking the positive approach is a better approach with that.
Yeah, I think at least in change of your title, you can move toward a sort of a new proposal for a reason eclecticism.
Right.
All right, it's 8 o'clock. We'll take about a 5-minute break, and Stephen Mapes, you'll be next.
Hey, nice job, David. I don't know if you need to stop sharing in order for me to start sharing
Yeah,
on mine.
he has to take his down.
Oh, okay. Thank you, David. I'll go ahead and share mine.
I just looked at the majority text has through his blood there in Hebrews 9:12. So wonder where those King James editors got with his blood. Where they got that? There has to be a textual variant, but there's not even a textual variant listed in UBS 3. Nothing said in majority text.
Would have had to come from Erasmus, wouldn't it?
Maybe it is.
He probably got out of the Vulgate.
All right, Stephen, go ahead and get started for us. And you got 20 minutes here, so about 8:26, 27. That's fine right there.
Okay, 8:26, 8:27. Got it. Well, we've had really good presentations so far, so I appreciate this opportunity. My topic for today on my dissertation proposal will be the Dead Sea Scrolls, a portrait of the Messiah in the servant songs of Isaiah. And in talking to one of the professors, he said that our title should have some sizzle and it should have some steak. So my intention is that the Dead Sea Scrolls and the portrait of the Messiah would be the sizzle, and then the steak would be grounding it in the servant songs of Isaiah. And actually, even in the title, I'm already making a statement that the servant songs of Isaiah are messianic, and that's going to be one of the things I'll need to show throughout the paper itself. So, of course, the four servant songs of Isaiah, just leading into this, describe the service, the suffering, the exaltation of the servant of the Lord. And Hoodman talked about all four songs showing the Messiah to be God's meek and gentle servant. He's a royal figure representing Israel in its ideal form. And Peter, in referring to the servant of God, says in Acts 3:13, actually throughout the Gospels, Jesus always did the will of the Father. Jesus never sought to please himself, but always to please the Father. That's in John 5:30. The first one is John 4:34. And Jesus finished the work that God sent him to do, John 17:4. Finally, Jesus came to glorify the Father. So in selecting this topic, the significance of the Dead Sea Scrolls is a compelling topic. Well, of course, the Dead Sea Scrolls, the greatest archaeological discovery probably in the 20th century, just 73 years ago. And when you look at the time frame of history, to have the Dead Sea Scrolls and to have those in its biblical text, about a third of the Dead Sea Scrolls are biblical texts. It's just a very compelling topic to go after. Of course, the Dead Sea Scrolls, and particularly the Great Isaiah Scroll that I'm going to be focusing on, the Dead Sea Scroll biblical texts predate the Masoretic texts by about 1,000 years, and they strengthen the validity of the Bible. The Great Isaiah Scroll is dated about 125 to 100 BC. That's kind of the range for the Great Isaiah Scroll. There are several actually manuscripts of Isaiah in the Dead Sea Scrolls. And the fact that in our generation, we have more Dead Sea Scrolls have been made available, made public. There's some of the legal issues have been settled, and beginning in the early 90s, a lot of these began to be published, some of them that were held back in the late 80s, early 90s. And we have more tools available that make examining the Dead Sea Scrolls just even a more compelling option. And even, for accordance having a Dead Sea Scroll module within the last 5 or 6 years. So more Dead Sea Scrolls available, more tools are available. And I thought in looking at the Dead Sea Scrolls, having a quote-unquote fresh Dead Sea Scroll case for Christ using a normal hermeneutic would be something that could keep this to the forefront and kind of keeping at bay some of the more liberal views about the Dead Sea Scrolls, or even anti-Christian interpretations around the Dead Sea Scrolls, and to keep this at the forefront as a dispensational, from a dispensational standpoint, the validity of the Bible using the Dead Sea Scrolls. So my thesis is the Dead Sea Scrolls provide a portrait of the Messiah that emerges in the four servant songs of Isaiah. And actually, in speaking with a Hebrew professor, I really wanted to get at this topic of the Messiah in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Of course, a lot has been done on Isaiah 53, the fourth song of the servant in Isaiah. And in talking with a professor, he talked about, hey, you know, if you look at all of the servant songs as providing a portrait of the Messiah, that can provide a more complete picture, and perhaps those other songs haven't been examined quite as much. And so I started researching that and found I could not find any work that had been accomplished on the Dead Sea Scrolls and the servant songs in entirety. A lot has been done on Isaiah 53, but not on the earlier songs and not strictly from the Dead Sea Scrolls. So to complete the thesis, the Dead Sea Scrolls provide a portrait of the Messiah that emerges in the four servant songs of Isaiah. This prophetic picture of the servant of the Lord finds its ultimate fulfillment in Jesus Christ. This research shall be accomplished by applying a consistent normal grammatical hermeneutic. And then I kind of go through the different things that I'm going to cover, such as presenting a historical and literary context overview, grammatical text and translation summary of the four servant songs from the Great Isaiah Scroll, a comparative analysis with the Masoretic text and the LXX, an examination of the servant song passages as quoted in the New Testament, And I did want to pull in the Essenic Peshurim, which are the commentaries from the Essenes who wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls or made the copies of the Dead Sea Scroll a biblical text, and an exegetical outline with expositional commentary and a biblical and theological synthesis. So that's what I want to cover in this dissertation. The need for the study. And again, as I mentioned, while a lot has been accomplished on the servant songs of Isaiah, and particularly a lot on the suffering servant in Isaiah 52, 12 through 53, 13, and their specific passages is found in the Dead Sea Scrolls, a complete review of every passage of the servant songs. So I want to make this a comprehensive review of the servant songs. And by the way, I'm focusing on the 4 servant songs. Sometimes scholars include Isaiah 61 as the 5th servant song. And I think it would take a lot more to cover that one. And that could probably be its own dissertation. And I don't know if I want to bite off more than I can chew, and including Isaiah 61. Most of the scholarship that I've read pretty much focuses on the 4 servant songs as being more of a unit. We do believe, of course, in the messianic nature of Isaiah 61 without a doubt. Again, I just think I'm going to have enough on the 4 servant songs. Of course, the servant songs describe the servant who will advance God's redemptive purposes for both Israel and the kingdoms of this world. The great Isaiah scroll is the centerpiece of the Dead Sea Scrolls. It's just, and I've really appreciated the Hebrew courses that we've taken at Calvary, and just the opportunity to dig and to work further in the Hebrew was very compelling as well. Of course, many consider the Dead Sea Scrolls to be the greatest archaeological find of the 20th century. It's the earliest known text containing all of the 4 servant songs and of Isaiah. It's the closest chronologically to the autographs. And a review of these passages in the context of the theology of Isaiah is needed. And then again, look at how they vary from the Masoretic text, the LXX, and look across all of these servant songs to provide a more complete portrait of the Messiah than just looking at the suffering servant in Isaiah 53. Also, the need for the study. The Essenes, of course, copied Isaiah from earlier manuscripts. Josephus describes the Essenes as one of the 3 main groups of Jews in this time period, together with the Pharisees and the Sadducees. They had their own community. A lot of archaeological work has been done. I probably will just touch on that briefly and show where they're located, but not make that a centerpiece of this. But the archaeology shows, the Essenes, where they lived. They found a lot of things that connect them to the scrolls, from vases and the ink wells and the areas where they actually made the text. And they consider themselves a fulfillment of Isaiah 40 and verse 3, just like John the Baptist. The voice of him that crieth in the wilderness, prepare ye the way of the Lord, make straight in the desert a highway for our God. Their writings reflect the importance of the prophet Isaiah in their eschatology. So I do want to include their commentaries, just as I do want to include the New Testament quotes of the songs of the servant. Also, they talk about the descriptions of the coming Messiah. They talk about a pierced Messiah. They refer to a suffering Messiah. So that's definitely helpful in pointing to fulfillment in Jesus Christ. Look at the New Testament writers. Also, a review of the Peshurim and the New Testament writings that refer to the servant song passages, as I mentioned. And finally, one of the things that I think is very compelling about the Dead Sea Scrolls and a messianic examination is the fact that non-Christian scholars, be it Hebrew, Jewish scholars or liberal scholars, but there's a lot of consensus around the early dating of the Dead Sea Scrolls, and particularly the great Isaiah scroll is being roughly 125 BC to 100 BC. So you take, in making an argument for those that are atheists, for those that are very liberal, and to show that we are taking texts that predate Jesus Christ, that absolutely predate Jesus Christ, and yet Jesus is the fulfillment of those passages. To me, that's a very strong case for the prophetic nature of the Bible. Literature review, I'm not going to go through all of that here, but basically I divided my literature review into the theological reviews of the Dead Sea Scrolls in New Testament by New Testament writers, more Christian writers, theological reviews of the Dead Sea Scrolls centered exclusively on the Hebrew Bible, so it could have been more Jewish scholars in this camp or more Old Testament scholars. Textual writings on the Dead Sea Scroll manuscripts themselves, people like, Evans, people talking about the textual nature, the archaeological books that examine the Qumran community, and then the historical books that look at the context of the era in which the Essenes wrote, and more ones that provided an overview of the Dead Sea Scrolls themselves. Some of the research questions that I ask, are the Dead Sea Scroll servant songs of Isaiah messianic? One of the things I have to counter is there are those that say, in particular, our Jewish friends that would say, Isaiah, the servant songs are Israel. But clearly, as you go through the servant songs, there's a transition to being an individual and not simply being Israel. And so one of the questions that I have here also, are the Dead Sea servant songs in Isaiah a dual prophecy that distinguishes between Israel as the servant and the messianic servant as the ultimate fulfillment? One of the examples I thought about is in Ezekiel, the chapter that talks about, and I know this is messianic, but the chapter that talks about the king of Tyre, and then it's obvious that he's not talking about the king of Tyre anymore. He's talking about the power behind the king of Tyre. Well, in the servant songs, it starts with Isaiah saying, Israel is my servant, but there's a clear transition to it being an individual. And as you go into the specifics of the servant songs, that becomes very apparent, such as the pulling out of his beard, the suffering servant, etc. In what ways, and of course, all 4 servant songs provide a more cohesive portrait of the Messiah. In what ways do the Dead Sea Scroll passages of the servant songs vary from the Masoretic text? Talked about that. Did the Essenes hold to a suffering Messiah in their Pesherim? Did the Essenes speak about substitutionary atonement and imputed righteousness? I believe they do in some of their writings. In what ways is Jesus the fulfillment of the Messianic portrait? Is the great Isaiah scroll reliable? There's some people that say because Isaiah 53 mentions the servant seeing light, and because the Essenes talk about being sons of light, that maybe they were biased in that way. However, as you look at the LXX, it also says that the servant in Isaiah 53 shall see light. And of course, that was not in the Masoretic text, and the King James Version of the Bible, for example, doesn't talk about that servant seeing light. We would say that would point to the resurrection. Evidences that the great Isaiah scroll predates Jesus. That's very good evidence, again, for the prophetic nature of the Bible. Let me just pick a couple here. Going to talk about the historical context, literary context of Isaiah. And then examine it. In what ways are these unique variances in the Dead Sea Scrolls versus the Masoretic text? And what way are these passages different or unique from other messianic passages? And I also found out that in the earlier servant songs 1 through 3, there were over 60 variations between the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Masoretic text. So that's worth examining, whereas there's about 30 variations in the 4th song where a lot of analysis has been done, a lot more has been written on. Then, because of our last class, we talked about New Testament, with the way the New Testament uses the Old Testament, is the rabbinical method Peshat? Is it Remez? Is it Drash? Is it Sod? I thought that was worth examining per David Cooper's book, Messiah. And what are the implications of Jesus being the Messiah of Israel? Of course, all the world should worship him as Lord and Savior. So that's what we want to point people to. Some of the things, problem areas. So I'm primarily trying to write to present and show those that are atheists and liberals the prophetic nature of the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Great Isaiah Scrolls that predates Jesus' life, and also those that criticize the prophetic nature of the Bible. Liberals are always trying to move the goalposts in the Bibles to dates that are after things that happened in prophecy, whereas we're showing this absolutely predates Jesus, and he fulfilled it as the suffering servant. Okay, I'll keep going. Here's my initial outline. again, was able to leverage, with Dr. Gromacki's help. He showed having an abstract first, illustrations, tables, acknowledgments. So this may look familiar, but I thought, hey, if this is working, I think it lays out a good path. In the introduction, the importance of Isaiah, the need for the study, the plan for the study, have my literature review. I talked about the different ways I would do that. I'll have a historical and literary overview with, all the basic things that we would go through in terms of authorship and origin, audience, occasion, date, genre, distinctive features. And then I'm going to have 4 main chapters on each of the servant songs. So I'll do a text and translation summary. The differences I talked about with the Masoretic text, the LXX, to look at how it's applied in the New Testament Pesherim, and each of the servant songs are quoted in the New Testament, so I can go through that explanation of Isaiah 42. And with that song, I just wanted to point out, we're all very familiar with the suffering servant, but as you go through the earlier ones as well, for example, the first servant song, Isaiah 42, is quoted in Matthew 12 and 18 and 20. The first 3 passages are applied to Jesus. Isaiah 42, this is my beloved son in whom I am well pleased, seems to be a divine allusion to Isaiah 42 as well. So I'm going to go through each of these songs, basically covering all these same things. The second servant song is Isaiah 49. And in Isaiah 49, we could have pull in Jeremiah, talks about the servant statements of Isaiah 49. It's also quoted in Ephesians 6:17, Hebrews 4:12. The third servant song, again, you get a better portrait of the Messiah by looking at all of them. For example, in the King James Version, in the Masoretic text, it talks about the suffering servant. Well, the suffering servant's more in the later songs, but it talks about hair being plucked out. But in the Dead Sea Scrolls, it says they pulled out my beard. This really speaks to something specific that happened to Christ, to an individual. That's in the third song. And I'm running out of time here, so I'll just wrap up this quickly. The third servant song is quoted in John 19, and Matthew 27, Philippians 2. And then finally, the fourth servant song, I'll just briefly mention because we're very familiar with the suffering servant of Isaiah, and I'll go through all those same areas as well. I'll have an analysis, theological implications, theological applications, have a summary of the study, a glossary, and a bibliography at the end. And then finally, I just wanted to say, in terms of usage of accordance, one of the things that really helps is the Dead Sea Scroll Biblical Corpus module, and I'll leverage that as well as all the other benefits we can use by using these tools, different searches. And I think I've pretty much used up my time. I have my bibliography at the end. And all right, that takes me to the end. Thank you very much. I know I spoke kind of quickly, but I'd be happy to entertain your questions as well. And by the way, one last point I wanted to make. I do realize that I'm going to be learning a lot. I may have to find out. I have not found anybody that's written on the Dead Sea Scrolls in terms of all the servant songs. But as I research this and find out if somebody's covered even the earlier songs more, then I may have to refine and adjust my topic and move in a new direction. But I sure would like to keep it into the Dead Sea Scrolls and Messianic.
Thank you, Stephen, for a great presentation there. Students, do you have questions or comments? Electronic hand, please. We'll start with Todd, then Ian.
So, great job, Stephen. Wow.
Oh, thank you.
My question is, I know there is other Isaiah manuscripts in the Dead Sea Scrolls. There's at least one. You probably more.
Yeah, there's like 4.
4. So in your research, did you do so far any kind of comparison with the great Isaiah scroll? Is that going to be a part of your studies? How will that factor into your?
And I need to do more digging on the specifics. As I did order one of the books that Dr. Gromacki recommended, which is the the Dead Sea Scroll Bible. And there are notes at the bottom that kind of say if the changes or the variations were due to the different texts. So I'm going to definitely leverage this thing as well as the module in accordance. But the Great Isaiah Scroll is the only one, of course, that had all 60 plus chapters. So that's going to be the one I leverage the most, and it's also the earliest. So that's the one I want to lean on, since it's 100 to 125 BC, and I think the other ones are dated, are not as old as the Great Isaiah Scroll. So that's definitely going to be the strongest evidence that I have, and the one I want to lean on the most.
Okay, just did you see it? Because I just vaguely remember that some of the other Isaiah scrolls show greater variance between them and the Masoretic text. Is that?
Mm-hmm. Yep. There was one point, you're right, where in Isaiah 16, the Great Isaiah Scroll was missing what we would like a part of verse 8 of chapter 16, 16 and verse 8. But the later scrolls actually, and Dr. Flint says that maybe a scribe or somebody had expanded in on verse 8 and wrote in some more, because the later versions of Isaiah ended up having the longer passage. I thought that was very interesting. So does that mean they weren't using the same original text? Does that mean something had happened over the course of a century to where they were using the expanded text? I thought that was very interesting. So I'm going to have to dig into that. But my thought was I want to stick with the Great Isaiah Scroll because it's the oldest one, and I think the strongest case for showing Jesus fulfilled this, and that scroll predates him by a century.
Go ahead, Ian.
All right. Well, great job, by the way. It's totally that's a really interesting topic of looking at Isaiah and Dead Sea Scrolls. I guess what my mind kind of was, I was kind of laughing to myself a little bit about once you begin to get into some of those other issues, like how John uses Isaiah and some of those issues. How are you going to kind of keep yourself kind of tethered to that? It sounds like you're also kind of balancing between an apologetic or a theological kind of so you may still have to kind of focus, because Isaiah studies in themselves is just a plethora of issues and material. But yeah, it's really interesting. So yeah, that was kind of my how have you kind of already run across that? I've kind of began to think about how you'll kind of narrow that to stay out of some of those hotbeds.
Yeah, narrowing it's going to be really hard. But I guess one of the things I was thinking about Dr. Gromacki's dissertation, and he covered the book of Isaiah. I'm like, well, these are 4 servant songs, so in terms of length, they're less. If I can just keep it on just those passages, you're right. I'm going to have to not go down rabbit holes and cover. I can't cover everything, and I was even wondering, can I even talk about the commentaries of the Essenes, because maybe that's even going too far, right? So you're right. That's going to be, I think, one of the real challenges of this is just limiting and keeping it very focused. It's going to be a challenge for sure.
Well, Stephen, so thank you for your presentation again. Just looking through, I enjoyed reading your literature review, but I was thinking of your outline for your dissertation, and you did some very good work here. What, about 9, 10? Let's see, I'm counting. I've done 9 pages on your literature review, but I was thinking you may want to just cut that part out. I hate to say it. Edit. But I'll tell you the reason why. You've got a lot of different books with a lot of different books on the Dead Sea Scrolls. So because your dissertation's focused on Isaiah, my suggestion would be that you maybe have a chapter or a section on the Great Isaiah Scroll, and that would then limit it. You could limit it to that, and that way you're not having to deal with all the textual issues and the other ones. Now, if you want to do that, that's fine, but you would have to do some comparative studies if you focus on that. But you could talk about the discovery of the Isaiah scroll, and you could get into some of the historical context with Qumran and all that in that particular chapter. So I was thinking that that might be a way to go. And then as I was reading your literature review, some of the sources you mentioned the connection to your theme of the Messiah, and the others were just, well, this is what Qumran is like, or this is, you know, something about a particular scroll or whatever. So you may need to limit, if you do decide to do a literature review chapter, limit it to those books that have some type of comment about the Messiah. And that way you can sort of trace it through. You might want to do it either by topic, and or you might want to do the literature review by some type of chronological approach. But you would have to see, sources that deal with a particular point in talking about the Messiah. I guess that's really the question. The other option would be just to focus, as you had, you've done a great job with your outline there for each one of the servant songs. So I do like the idea of a historical literary text, the servant songs in Isaiah. I like that, dealing with not only the historical context, literary context, where you might want to talk about the argument. Make sure you talk about how the servant songs fit into the argument of Isaiah. So that's where discourse analysis comes into play there. I didn't see the New Testament text. You mentioned the servant songs quoted in the New Testament, but I did not see them in your outline. So you did mention it in your presentation. So you need to make sure you indicate where those texts are found in the New Testament. And that's going to be very, very important, especially those that are quoted in the Gospels, anything that relates to Jesus as Messiah. One more thing, and we'll be finished. Pre-trib conference, probably one of the greatest messages I heard, Dr. Arnold Fruchtenbaum on Isaiah 53. And if you get a chance to hear that presentation and or get his paper, basically in that paper, he talks about how rabbis before Christ saw Isaiah 53 as messianic. After Christ, they changed their interpretation. So that's very, very interesting. So you have a messianic interpretation of Isaiah 53 by rabbis. That'd be interesting to see where those sources are. It was just an amazing presentation. Rabbis saying that these are messianic texts, Isaiah 53. And as you know, oftentimes that text is not read in the synagogue today. So that's important in terms of apologetics. All right, thank you. Let's take another 5-minute break, and Todd Meyerdick up next. You have a PowerPoint tonight?
Yes, I do.
Okay, great.
Man, Grammatically, guys are doing a good job.
Are you ready tonight to talk us through some of the things you've been studying?
I'm gonna talk.
All right. You're gonna get your 20 minutes.
I don't know what it's gonna sound like, but I'm gonna say something.
Okay. All right, you'll be last tonight.
Okay, excellent.
Is my PowerPoint up?
Yes, we can see it there, Todd.
Okay, cool.
Everybody ready to go?
Yep.
All right,
Yep.
Go ahead, Todd. You can take us till about 2 after 9. Okay, go ahead.
Okay. Let me see. So, my title is pretty lengthy, and maybe hopefully it's got a lot of steak. I don't know how much sizzle. I'm thinking if I ever was to get this printed in a book, I would probably have to revise the title, but critical and biblical analysis of the position of the new perspective on Paul regarding Paul's teaching on the law, its nature, purpose, and function. So, and to be honest, when I started this, I kind of was wanting to avoid getting into a critique of new perspective on Paul, but that's kind of where I've ended up. So my thesis, so the objective of this study is to demonstrate that the position of the new perspective on Paul regarding Apostle Paul's understanding of the nature, purpose, and function of the law is intrinsically flawed, which, as I'm thinking about that as a thesis statement, I think I would probably want to revise that. That comes across pretty harsh, but the intention of this study would be to basically show how I don't know how you put this graciously, but they have gone off track biblically, and that their position regarding Paul's understanding of the law and justification cannot be sustained biblically. So the argument of my thesis, how I'd present this would be that by comparing their conclusions with those of some careful exegetical study of primarily in Galatians and Galatians and Romans, passages, Galatians 2, 3, and particularly also in, a lot of Romans, but Romans chapter 3, just doing careful study of those texts to see if it's possible for their very, I'm not sure the term I'm looking for, but their significant departure from traditional hermeneutical conclusions regarding the law, justification, in Paul. And I know that we're supposed to go into this unbiased, but it's been a challenge for me to come at this like an objective evaluation of the new perspective of Paul, because from the outset I see that there's so many areas where just their view of Scripture, their some of the underlying presuppositions that are so different that it's a little challenging for me to come at this as objective as I'd like to. I've included in my argument, which, just to be honest, I'm uncertain about how realistic this is, but to take on Sanders' study of Second Temple Judaism literature in regards to first century Judaism's view of the law of justification, but I think it's somewhat essential to, and I don't know if a study can be done without addressing that in any kind of a critique of new perspective of Paul, because that's really foundational. And there's the aspect of the Second Temple Judaism's view of the law and justification. And then there's the second half of that is the whole discussion and debate is then the Apostle Paul and his understanding. And it's dealing with both, I think, is challenging. So I probably would only address, if it's possible, to just address Sanders on a somewhat cursory manner. But I think he has to be dealt with it to some degree. And I think for my purposes, to show a reasonable doubt about his conclusions of first century Judaism being monolithic in its what he calls covenantal nomonism, that's not an airtight argument on his part. That is, well, as D.A. Carson, it's much more variegated nomonism. There was a much broader view. So if there's, because the issue is, what was Paul contending against in Galatians and Romans? Was it legalism, legalistic justification? And Sanders would argue from Second Temple Judaism's literature, they believed in grace and faith, well, primarily grace and election, and weren't legalistic in their understanding of justification. So it's impossible that Paul was arguing or contending with a legalistic justification. And so if I think for my purposes in this study, just to show that there is reasonable doubt that that view was not monolithic within Judaism, that there could have been at least some, or not the majority, of first century Judaism that would have been seeking self-righteous justification. But so the need for the study is there is been vast amounts published and a lot of discussion and debates been already done on this topic. So I have wrestled with the question, is there anything that I could contribute to the discussion? But I concluded there's really a number of reasons why study still needs to be done in regards to the Apostle Paul and his understanding of the law and justification. And one of the primary reasons is because the magnitude of the issue that is at stake in this debate is really the message of the gospel itself. N.T. Wright has said in print that the message of the gospel is not about how someone is saved from sin. So, I mean, we're talking not about periphery issues of doctrine, Christian doctrine, but at the very heart of it. So a issue that's this big, I think, is, even though so much has already been written about it, that there's still much more needs to be heard and said about it. Secondly, the number of published studies that really focus in on a critique of the new perspective on Paul's understanding of the law itself are somewhat limited. They're out there. There'll be a chapter in a book, but I did not come across something that was just an extensive, focused study of a comparison between the new perspective of Paul and Paul's writings on just the focus topic of the law itself, and the law in its nature, and how it functions and what its purpose. So, and also, as I've been going through the published literature on this subject, it really does seem to be a conversation that currently is taking place primarily amongst covenant theologians, theologians of Reformed background mindset. So on both sides of the debate, it is being held between those who are of Reformed leaning, and there is a little bit out there written by dispensationalists, but I think the dispensational viewpoint is really being unrepresented, and this is something that I would like to investigate more. Might take, if I'm to continue on this track of the study for a dissertation, I think it would be really interesting to do more investigation of how a dispensational perspective would bring kind of a new perspective to the whole debate, because some of the issues that are dealt with in this really are touch points for differences between covenant theology and dispensational theology, like the placing of judgment, whether there's a single judgment, if there's like for us, the Bema seat of Christ, a judgment of rewards, which it's getting beyond the law, but that's an area of interest that I might end up going down that track. So I think there is, in spite of the amount that has already been published on this, I still think there is a real need for this discussion, particularly considering how critical what's at stake in regards to the study. So just as far as literature review, I've looked at this chronologically and began back actually a ways prior to what would be considered the inception of the new perspective on Paul, but with Christopher Stendahl and his introspective conscience of the West, where he challenged the idea that that the ancients like Paul would have had any sense of self-awareness of their sinfulness, any sense of needing to be justified. And he's seminal. He's Sanders, E.P. Sanders' book, Paul and Palestinian Judaism, is definitely more foundational, but I think Christopher Stendahl really played I think, and I would like to do more study on this, I think he probably had a significant influence on Sanders. And it feels like a little bit to me like Sanders was hunting, maybe this is an unfair accusation, but I can see how he might have been looking, in a sense, to fulfill Christopher Stendahl's premise in his research of Palestinian Judaism. That's something I would like to investigate a little more closely. And I'm not certain about this, but I believe James Dunn's article in the Bulletin of John Ryland's Library in 1983 was when the term New Perspective on Paul was created or adopted. And that article is I think, a crucial article in the argument, because one of the key tenets, I guess you would say, New Perspective of Paul, is that when Paul talks about that no one is, in Galatians, that no one is justified by works of the law, that Dunn gives works of the law a very restricted sense, and talks about that being limited to those kind of laws that would give the Israelites a sense of national or ethnic identity that would separate them from the Gentiles, like circumcision and the dietary laws. And so that leaves open, and there's some ambiguity, at least in my mind, then, okay, what about the rest of the works of the law, or the rest of the law? Is Paul not then saying that we cannot, that we can in any sense be justified through the law outside of those what Dunn calls boundary markers? And that really, I think, is a critical issue for the New Perspective of Paul's understanding of justification, and is really getting at what I think is, whether they intend it or not, undermining justification by faith. And a couple other works I pointed out here: John Piper's book, The Future of Justification, and N.T. Wright's Justification, God's Plan, Paul's Vision. Those two, well, Piper's book is a response to Wright, and then Wright then responds to Piper. And Wright has published, and I forgot the title of it, a huge volume on Paul that's probably really a critical book to review for this study. So this is a sampling of some of my thoughts as to what questions I would need to answer in addressing my topic for my thesis. Is obviously, what does the law mean for Paul, and what is its relationship to justification? And what does it mean for Paul to uphold the law? I think big issue in this is that it might be something of a secondary issue, but I do think it's probably somewhat central to this whole discussion, is what some theologians would call the inconsistency of Paul on his view of the law. Sometimes he says, he appears to be saying the law should be set aside. At other times, he seems to be saying that the law still has value, and really reconciling Paul's. I think it's possible in this study to be able to come to some kind of reconciliation of Paul's comments on the law that seem to apparently contradict each other. Okay, so for my outline, chapter 1, introduction, would give an overview of the history of the debate. Something similar to what I talked about in my literature review, which probably might be a part of this. The need for the study, which I've talked about. Go over how I'm going to approach the the discussion in my dissertation, the structure of the dissertation, deal with important terminology. And then chapter 2, just give a basic overview, kind of a what's the term I'm looking for, a trainer, I guess, to those who might not be so familiar with the new perspective on Paul, on their foundational presuppositions. So I'd be discussing what covenantal nomonism is, talking about works of the law, boundary markers, a number of other issues that, and then discuss where they have significantly departed from traditional understanding of Paul. And then, as I mentioned, I think it would be somewhat necessary to include this critique of Sanders' study on the Second Temple Judaism, and I'm a little intimidated by that, but I think there has to be something done in any kind of rebuttal to new perspective on Paul that would address Sanders and what's really been, at this point, Pauline studies kind of taken as the gospel truth. So a critique of his conclusions. And as I mentioned earlier, the purpose of this chapter would not be to prove that Sanders was completely wrong. It would just be to establish that there is some reasonable doubt as to his premise that Judaism was really a monolithic, and they were all holding to the same position. Is if you can show that there was a possibility that some of the Jews in Paul's time did hold to a legalistic justification, then why do we need to come up with some other explanation as to what Paul was contending with? So chapter 4, I would begin looking at and doing exegetical work on the major passages in Paul's text, primarily in Galatians and Romans, dealing with the purpose and the function of the law. So the law, looking at law and how it relates to judgment, and the mind of Paul, as future judgment, how it relates to justification. Can someone be justified by keeping the law? As Paul makes a statement that it's not the hearers of the law who are justified, but the doers. And then later he says no one can be justified by works of the law. In chapter 5, dealing more with the nature of the law, and it might make sense to reverse these chapters, put the nature first, but that just occurred to me. But so discussing some of the issues, how does the law relate to the Mosaic law, relate to Gentiles in relationship to the Jews, its unity and disunity? Can the law be divided up into categories like boundary markers, ceremonial versus moral and civil? Okay, so then chapter 6 would specifically focus on comparing the findings, the conclusions of chapter 4 and 5 with the presuppositions of the new perspective on Paul. So in regards to Paul's understanding the purpose and the function, and the nature, his understanding of the nature in comparison to new perspective of Paul. And then conclude chapter 7 just with some concluding thoughts about new perspective of Paul and its implications for Pauline studies, for our understanding of the gospel, and then, okay, just areas for further study. That's what I've got.
Well, Todd, that was a great presentation. And as you were talking there, I was thinking, you were talking about entering into the conversation. So I was thinking of an analogy of a bunch of scholars around the table talking about the new perspective on Paul. And you've got Piper and you've got N.T. Wright. And you pull up your chair between Piper and N.T. Wright, and you say to John Piper, I agree with a lot of things that you say, but you're coming from it from a covenant viewpoint. I want to share with you my dispensational view of the law, which is different from your covenant view. And N.T. Wright, let me share with you my critique of your new perspective. So you've entered into the conversation as a dispensationalist. So I actually put down here a new title for you, Todd.
Okay, I hope it's shorter than mine.
It's a lot shorter. A dispensational critique of the new perspective on Paul.
Oh, that's good. I like that.
So
I gotta admit, I'm very intimidated by the idea of pulling my chair up in between N.T. Wright and John Piper. But
and you've got 3 years to learn their arguments, to master their arguments, and to critique them from a exegetical viewpoint. So you're the man. You're the guy. You're going to critique their views on the law. Yeah.
Okay,
we definitely need it.
I'm still praying about if this is really the dissertation I want to do, but
well, I think you did a great job here. I especially enjoyed your literature review and your summary of just the debate, and I'd like to see that fleshed out, especially just to see the arguments of N.T. Wright and Sanders, and then how you'd interact with that. So let somebody else share. Students, question, comment? All right, David, go ahead.
I appreciate what you're doing there, Todd, and the only thing I would just say, this is maybe a rabbit trail, but something that always comes up with me when people talk about the law. I deal with a guy regularly who's part of the Messianic Roots movement, and they always get tangled up with what the law is and defining the law. And I think it's helpful when we talk about the law. I don't know if you have a plan for this, to say, are we differentiating the law and the prophets and the wisdom literature? Or are we differentiating it like ceremonial law, civil law, moral law? And how are you defining the law, and what passages define that law that Paul then goes on to use? Because I think a lot of times we just talk about it in generic terms, and we have an idea, but for other people, they don't always define it the way we do. So I think it might be helpful to have a clear definition.
yeah, that's a great thought. I've thought about how people categorize it as the ceremonial versus the moral and civil, but I don't know why it didn't occur to me, but that's a great thought about thinking about, okay, what aspect of the old, is he just talking Pentateuch? Is he talking the the prophets and the writings. Yeah, thank you. That's a great thought.
Yeah, I tried to raise my hand, but for some odd reason, my hand's not working. But I wanted to say that I have a friend of mine that is actually a Moody Bible graduate and a DTS graduate, and he moved all across the world, if you will, with the intent to reach Jewish people. And then he moved back to Houston, and he's now working at a Messianic Jewish congregation, if you will. And he did I don't know why he did it, and I think I still have the material that he used because he went to DTS. He footnoted and dealt with his sources, but he did almost like an 8-week lesson or series training at that congregation on the Apostle Paul, and his whole argument was Paul became a born again believer, but he did not abandon his Judaism. And in that material, he talked about how Paul kept the law. And so it'd be interesting to see if I find it. If I find it, I will let you know. And if I have to make copies of it, I don't know if it's going to be of any help. But if I have to make copies of it, because he made that statement, if I have to make copies of it, I will, and I'll get your address, and either I'll email it to you, or I'll mail it to you, because he dealt with a lot of Jewish rabbis. This guy's kind of like real smart kind of guy. So he had a lot of material, a lot of information, and I'll try to get that information for you.
Okay, I'd appreciate that, Andre. Yeah, I mean, as I was doing this study, I gotta say I wasn't overly familiar with a new perspective on Paul before I started into this, and realize I'm pretty far behind the curve, because I mean, it's 30 years old, and now there's a lot where they're gone well beyond even the assumptions of the new perspective on Paul. I think, I'm trying to remember, I think they're calling it the radical perspective on Paul now, where essentially they're saying Paul just stayed a Jew. He had no conversion. There was no real significant change in Paul from prior to Damascus Road to after Damascus Road.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yes. Yep.
Wow, you're going to need to deal with that one, Todd. Sure. All right, yeah. Steve, you had a question or comment?
This will be a real quick question, and that is, I think this is a fantastic topic just because justification by faith alone is so critical to us, and so we have to understand, Paul's argument really strong. If you could just, you went through some really good things in your literature review. If you could just recommend what's the best single book, for one of us to understand this one better, which one would you recommend?
That's a great question.
It's Yet to Be Written by Todd Meyerdirk.
Yeah.
That's why you can't bring it to mind.
No, I'm blanking because it's 4 a.m, but where I am, what's his name? Justification Revisited, I think, is the title. Let me see, I can pull it up. Justification Reconsidered by Westerholm. Unfortunately, I didn't have access to Piper's book other than what I could read of the sample on Amazon. I think I need to read that cover to cover. I would But as far as one that's just a good, justification reconsidered, and I guess would be the one I would probably suggest.
I definitely would read Piper, The Future of Justification, Response to N.T. Wright. So that would really help you understand the contemporary debate.
Thank you.
All right, we're going to take about a 4-minute break this time, since it's 9:20. It'll be 9:20, and Andre is going to share what he's been working on. He's still feverishly studying and writing, and he'll get that done this weekend, he said. But I did want him to share some of the things that he's been researching and studying these 8 weeks with all of us. So come back at 20 after, about 3-minute break here, and then we'll have him share.
Can I ask you a quick question, Dr. Gromecki?
Yes.
My comments about Sanders and including any kind of a response, discussion of him, do you think that's...
I think that when you get to explaining the new perspective, understanding the different arguments, and you may want to try to see, are there distinctive positions within the new perspective? So that may be, as you define it, what does Sanders say? What does Dunn say? What does N.T. Wright say? Are they saying the same thing? Are they saying different things? And if they're saying different things, are they critiquing one another? So you'll need to see, is it a monolithic new perspective on Paul, or is it variated new perspective? If it's variated, if it's variated, then that's the challenge for you to interact with the different perspectives in the new perspective, and that will set apart your dissertation, rather than putting everybody, lumping them all together. It shows that you've done your research and your homework, and you're recognizing the distinctions within this perspective.
Okay. So as far as the Second Temple Judaism and Sanders, from what I've seen, they all agree and they all accept Sanders' conclusions on that.
And you could actually say that that's sort of like the root, and everything else is the fruit. Then if they're all going back to that same.
It does need to be addressed to some degree in the dissertation, right?
Yep. Yes, it does.
Yeah, which I'm just thinking, I wouldn't have to learn to read unpointed Aramaic to be able to deal with it.
Well, it's learning to evaluate the exegetical and theological arguments. So you're looking at, you're reading their literature, you're looking at the text itself, Romans and Galatians, and that's where you're doing your homework first. Do your exegetical studies as you get into like exegesis of the Greek New Testament. Do something on that. That's going to help you go down the road.
Yeah, the challenge is that there are those who would completely agree with me exegetically on Romans and Galatians and the Pauline epistles, but then would agree with Sanders, and the way they would resolve the tension is say, well, Paul was misrepresenting Judaism, he was contradicting himself, which obviously not a conclusion I want to come to.
Right. Well, that again shows they don't believe in inerrancy, obviously, if they're going to that conclusion. So, yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
All right.
All right. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. Andre, you ready to go?
Yes, sir. I just wrote something on my PowerPoint.
Okay, so you want to share your PowerPoint with us?
yeah, there's something that my wife said, why do you do stuff like this? I'll write stuff, and if it's wrong, I'll just get corrected on spot. When I first started Bible college, I would just write papers and like write them, and like if it's wrong, and then let the professor critique it. And my wife would ask, why do you do that? Like, I figure like this. It's like baseball. I'm gonna swing at the first thing the pitcher throw. If I miss, I miss. After that, I know what he gonna try to throw next. You know what I'm saying? And so, as a professor critiquing, I'm like, okay, now I know that professor. I can go ahead and write the rest of my papers accordingly. So
Very good.
I just wrote something down. If it's wrong, it's wrong, and then we're gonna go from there. So how do I share?
There's a little arrow pointing up into a box. That's what you share. If you click on that, you should see it on the bottom of your screen.
See that?
There it is, and put it into your presentation mode or slide presentation there.
So do I click on my PowerPoint again?
Yeah, I can actually see your slide, but you need to put it into a presentation.
Like that?
Yeah, now we see it. That's good. Okay. Go ahead and go. You're gone. You're
all right. So this is what I just wrote. I don't know if that's correct, but my title, and I just felt like I needed a subtitle just because I didn't like that empty box at the bottom. So, but my title will be Crystallizing Christ. And the subtitle, we'll decide if that's correct when I'm finished with my presentation. Looking at Hebrews through the lens of pastoral theology. And so, is that correct? I want to make sure. Yeah, so this is a book literature review that I looked at. Essential to the argument, since the author Hebrew is the only NT writer who explicitly explores and expounds upon the faithfulness of Christ in any degree of detail, and this is by Todd D. Steele's Christos as Pistos, the faithfulness of Christ in the epistles to the Hebrews draws attention to the contribution Hebrews can offer in the Pistos Christo debate. The subjunctive genitive reading finds support in Hebrews' recurring portrayal of Jesus' faithfulness, which is directed toward both God, expressed primarily in terms of sonship, and I'll deal with some of these chapters later in the presentation, and community for whom he is faithful. He is a faithful high priest. So my argument is going to be around the faithfulness of Christ Jesus, and we'll discuss why that is so. So my potential thesis, and it comes out in my thesis, is potential thesis. The purpose of this dissertation is not necessarily to argue the author's intended purpose for writing the epistle to the Hebrews, although this dissertation will offer a view that will provide a biblical line of evidence to support the view presented. However, the purpose of this dissertation is to demonstrate how the author used paranetic rhetoric as a method to develop his Christology, to instruct his audience and exhort them to live faithfully as those who... Oh, did I mess that up?
No, that's fine.
You guys still see that?
Yep.
Okay. For those who inherited salvation. So I'll read that part again. However, the purpose of this dissertation is to demonstrate how the author used paranetic rhetoric as a method to develop his Christology, to instruct his audience and exhort them to live faithfully as those who inherited salvation. Paranesis. So this is by Buckham. Well defines paranesis as a form of address which not only commends but actually enumerates precepts or maxims which pertain to moral aspiration and the regulation of human conduct. Paranetical discourse in the Greco-Roman period, and I'll be using this a part of my literature review, dealing with other extra biblical material in the Roman Greco period that used paranesis for hortatory purposes. And so bringing that out is just to show that maybe the author of Hebrews in that cultural context kind of gleaned from his surroundings and how they use paranesis to exalt and to exhort their audience to respond to certain messages. And so it was used by Socrates in his moral essays and his letter to Demonicus. And so I'll be looking at other material to kind of learn how the author of Hebrews used paranesis to exalt his audience for hortatory purposes. So paranesis and the passion. And so we're all familiar with this famous passage of scripture used in the Gospels. And also you see the print of paranetic thought as it unveils how the author of Hebrews used Psalm 22:2 in Hebrews chapter 2, verse 11. And so that Psalm 22:2 in that community context, it literally says, the author of Hebrews says, and he was not ashamed to call them brothers. So that context in Psalm 22:1, of course, that's the passion cry is what I call it when Messiah cries out, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani. My God, why have thou forsaken me? And so within that context, Jesus is suffering and he's bringing, if you will, the body of Christ into relationship with the eternal God. And so I want to read Hebrews chapter 2, as there are a few passages that I will kind of give a lot of attention to in my dissertation to make sure that I'm covering this paranetic idea of how the author of Hebrews is calling his audience to faithfulness in Christ Jesus. So in Hebrews 2, verse 11, and then I'll come back later and I'll read the context of that in the presentation. But in verse 11, it reads, "For he who sanctifies and those who are sanctified all have one source. That is why he is not ashamed to call them brothers." And so in the context of Psalm 22, verse 1 is where we read in Matthew, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? And in that context, he's bringing us into the community under the guard or the government of his faithfulness, him being faithful to the one who called him, which is another text in the Hebrew, the letter to the Hebrews. And so I'll be using those passages to strengthen my argument. So the purpose of the passion, and this comes from another literature review book that I'm looking at, Christopher Richardson. The passion, reconsidering Hebrews 5:7-8, offers a compelling argument for interpreting 5:7-8 as a vivid account of Jesus' high priestly suffering at Golgotha. Although many have seen the passage as referring to Gethsemane, Richardson contends it is descriptive of Jesus' suffering on the cross, where he offered up prayers and requests as he was offering himself. It is also, along with 1:3, proof of Jesus functioning as a priest on the cross. Furthermore, Jesus' prayers for personal deliverance and were heard because of his reverent submission. And so using the faithfulness of Jesus Christ as a paranetic thought to call the church to faithfulness, or paranetic rhetoric to call the church to faithfulness, and highlighting the fact that even Jesus' prayers was answered because he was submitted, he was faithful and obedient. So this last sentence, which is the highlight or kind of like the core of my argument, a hortatory purpose informs this presentation as the recipients of Hebrews are exhorted to follow Jesus' example of confident interaction with God. So paranesis in Hebrews, this comes from Attridge and Corster. Hebrews, as we have seen, is a balanced combination of doctrinal exposition and paranesis. Any assessment of its overall meaning needs to take both dimensions of the work equally into account. The paranesis is not a perfunctory afterthought to a dogmatic treatise, and the pastoral thrust of the work is clear. Yet neither is the doctrinal exposition and unimaginative repetition of well-worn truths adduced to support an exhortation. Rather, in that exposition, we find a highly creative adaptation of early Christian tradition. And so I'll be using this paranetic rhetoric to push the thrust of my argument, which points to the faithfulness of Jesus Christ, laying that down as a foundation. And so the Christological emphasis of the Passion is designed to evoke community, efficacy towards holiness, obedience, and commitment to God. So these are some of the questions that that I would ask. I'm not going to read all of them for the sake of time, but of course, what is the author's primary argument to his audience? What is the audience attitude towards the author's gospel message? I would definitely deal with what is the author's Christological view. As I said in my dissertation, the author uses paranetic rhetoric to build his Christological view, or to unveil his Christological view. And then how significant are the warning passages to the author's primary message? And then, of course, my what is the author's theology of faith? How does the author use the faithfulness of Christ to admonish his audience? So those are some of the questions that I would have to answer in the dissertation. The source of the argument. So this idea of us being in community and being in fellowship and inheriting this, as the Hebrews author says, this heavenly calling, share the same source, the same origins, the same oneness. This is where I'll do a lot of exegetical work as to what that means, to build upon my argument. So that brings me back to the context of Hebrews chapter 2, and then verse 10, and I love this verse. It says, "For it was fitting that he for whom and by whom all things exist, in bringing many sons to glory, should make the founder of their salvation perfect through suffering." And so this idea that we cannot abandon faithfulness to Christ because we are suffering within the world in which we live. And so I'll deal with that extensively in the dissertation. One of the guys that helped me out a lot was Moffitt. I loved reading his stuff. He has a lot to say. Talking to my Greek prof from CBS earlier today, Dr. Trace Howard, who, by the way, says that he took class with Dr. Gramacki. So he told me to give you a shout out. Dr. Gramacki said you may not remember him because you're a superstar now, but just to give you a shout out. So I'm giving Dr. Trace Howard a shout out to you because he wanted me to tell you hello. But Moffitt, he really helped me out. And I like what he said in this sense of the paranesis idea being in the book of Hebrews, and how the author used that rhetoric to call the church to faithfulness as he highlights the faithfulness of Christ. He says the special line of argument which he adopts in 5 through 10, so chapters 5 through 10, and I'll come back and read that parenthetical statement that I made after I read the whole sentence. The special line of argument which he adopts in chapter 5 through chapter 10, verse 18, must be connected somehow with the danger in which he felt his friends involved. And this is only to explain if we assume that their relaxed interest in Christianity arose out of an imperfect conception of what Jesus meant for their faith. And so I wanted to extend in my argument, not to add to, if you will, or to undermine Moffat's argument, but to extend in my argument, I wanted to extend from chapter 5 to chapter 10, and I wanted to go all the way to verse 23. And I won't read all of that, of course, because of time, but I want to read at least a little bit of chapter 10. And I want to read this part that I feel like would help me exegetically and theologically, from a pastoral sense, build my argument. And it says, and I'm just going to start at verse 19. It says in Hebrews chapter 10, verse 19, therefore, brothers, since we have confidence, and that's that use of dia, which I'll deal with that in my dissertation also. Therefore, brothers, since we have confidence to enter the holy places by the blood of Jesus, by the new and living way that he opened for us through the curtain that is through his flesh. And since we have a great high priest over the house of God, let us draw near with a true heart in full assurance of faith, with our hearts sprinkled clean from an evil conscience and our bodies washed with pure water. And then this last verse, let us hold fast the confession of our hope without wavering, for he who promised is faithful. And so using that text to really build my argument will be essential or vital if this proposal or this particular dissertation idea will seem to be acceptable. So any questions? What I'm hoping, up to this point, I have not discovered an argument against the author's use of paranetic rhetoric. However, I have not yet discovered any work that discusses how the author used paranetic rhetoric to develop his Christological or develop his Christology and to call his audience to salvific faithfulness. So what I'm hoping is, thinking about contribution, if I can't find a debate that I can enter into, perhaps I can just contribute something to the world of academia and to the world of the church that could be used maybe in a pastoral class, or could be used as a pastoral handbook for pastors, if you will, across the country, if not the world. So that's kind of like the idea of what I'm thinking about. I took a pastoral theology class at DTS, and if I could be honest, it didn't really help me a lot to deal with pastoral issues where the church is concerned from the scriptures, if at all. And so my idea is that for pastoral theology classes or pastoral ministry classes or things like that, maybe this work could be of some use if I can do a good enough job with it.
All right. Thank you, Andre, for sharing what you're working through and researching. Some questions from the students, then I'll make some comments to finish our class tonight. Electronic hand, please. You can take down your PowerPoint, and that way we can see everybody.
How do I do that?
Go back and just that little arrow, I think.
Hit X.
Yeah, exit out. Yeah, there it is. Thank you.
Got you. All right.
Questions, comments? Go ahead, Stephen.
Yeah. So thank you, Andre. I really appreciated what you were sharing, especially when you talked about using Psalm 22:1, what Christ said on the cross, quoting Psalm 22:1. He was coming as a high priest, offering his prayers. I was just wondering, when you talked about the paranesis, and I'm sorry if I said that wrong, as you were, what was it that got you? What was your aha moment when you were kind of going through your studies, and
this is very interesting to me, but I was just wondering what kind of grabbed you as you were doing your studies, that where the light bulb went on and you're like, yeah, this is something we need to talk about in Hebrews.
Well, what happened as I was looking through all of the Hebrew literature, and of course, and looking through the commentaries and the Hebrew surveys and analysts, things like that, a lot of it was real good, and I will use a lot of that information as I'm writing my dissertation. But none of it dealt with the reasons as to why the author decided to use the literary device that he was using. They just said a lot of them just talk about how brilliantly it's written. But when it comes to Paul, they can really kind of talk about why Paul did this and why he stated this way. But when it comes to the book of Hebrews, there's no information like that. And I think that if it's easily seen with one author, they do the same thing with Peter, and they critique Peter's use of Greek in many ways. They didn't do none of that when it comes to the author of Hebrews, but they do identify that he's using this literary device to write his epistle. But in the Roman Greco period, these guys, like I said, Socrates, like that's what he was. He was an orator, and he used certain literary devices to get his message across, and he felt like it would impact his audience in a certain way. So my idea is that perhaps the author of Hebrews was doing the same thing.
Thank you.
Go ahead, Todd.
I think Ian is next.
I'm sorry.
He had his hand up first.
Go ahead, Ian. Go ahead.
No problem. Hey, Andre, that's really awesome. This is really a cool concept to really kind of look at, and you could probably branch it out to like the use of rhetoric in the New Testament. But, perhaps where you can kind of come into a debate, even with this perspective from a pastoral perspective, is how does this concept then relate to those warning passages in Hebrews where, then the debate gets to, why are those being used? What does that refer to? So maybe kind of begin to use this as a way to kind of show, well, it's not talking about losing salvation. It's talking about